Welcome to the Earth Keepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earth Keepers community, that includes our spiritual practices. My name is Forrest Inslee, and today, my co-host James Amadon and I will be talking with Victoria Loorz, founder of the Wild Church Network. The Wild Church Network is a broad association of religious communities that practice faith life in ways that foster connectedness to all of creation. A key practice of a wild church is holding some or all of their community gatherings in the outdoors, encouraging and guiding people to sense God's presence in the natural world. Now, you might recall from a previous episode with Lenore Three Stars that an essentially indigenous value is seeking to be a good relative among all the myriad beings that make up the family of creation. In a similar way, wild churches seek to cultivate this dynamic of relationship that they call kindom, that is Kindom. In her forthcoming book called Church of the Wild, Victoria writes, "As we sit in our homes awaiting the outcome of the first global pandemic of our generation, we can't look away anymore from the reality, both tragic and beautiful, that we are all deeply interconnected. Humans, animals, trees, oceans, bacteria, bees, God. A new worldview is emerging, beyond dominion and even stewardship, into relationship and respect and love for all others. It is a worldview of belonging, a kingdom of God that includes the whole system of life, that regards all humans and all species as inherently good and valuable. A kingdom that loves neighbors, all neighbors, even those of other species, as ourselves, that does unto others, all others, as we would have them do unto us. By leaving buildings and reconnecting with the natural world as sacred, it is waking up from a dream, like Jacob, and seeing for the first time, shouting with an exploded open heart, 'This place, the holy is in this place, and I couldn't see it.'" Welcome, friends, to the Earth Keepers podcast. Welcome, Victoria. Before we talk about what it is that you do with Wild Church, really, I wanted to get a sense of who you are as a person. But let's go ahead and start out with a real basic overview of what it is you do day to day. And then I want to actually ask you some questions about your history, your story.
My daily life is not a whole lot different because I've been working from home for years. So a lot of networking, a lot of talking with people all over the country, all over North America, really. There's a lot of people in Canada. And all of it is around the connection between spirituality and nature. So I have a few projects. The Wild Church Network, which is a group of more and more pastors who are leaving buildings to connect directly with the natural world from many denominations. Then I have my own little wild church here in Bellingham, Washington. I also co-founded and guide a year-long program, an eco-ministry certificate program through Seminary of the Wild. We do a lot of other programs to deepen into this work. What does it look like to be connected to the natural world as sacred as Christians?
So much of what you do, I would imagine, is grounded in your person, in your relationship to God, in your relationship to nature. So maybe tell us a bit about that. How would you describe your relationship to creation?
It's interesting. When I grew up, I usually lived in suburban places. A lot of people grew up on farms or that are doing this, grew up on farms, are deeply connected with the woods. But I always lived in a suburb. And so it would be little fields, little places behind the house, under the fences. And I would have, particularly remember as a teenager, that I had a little place that was very much a sacred place. I didn't have language or context for it at all. It was an early connection with God. We didn't really go to church except Christmas and Easter growing up. But it was a numinous experience that I had absolutely no language for. A few years later, in my 20s, I converted officially in an evangelical church. And I began to have language for what I had experienced when I was younger. But it was very detached from the natural world. That wasn't part of the story. So again, didn't really have language for it, but I had these experiences that now Jesus and relationship with God. And I was drawn to the mystics, the desert mystics early on, which was sort of a parallel experience from my evangelical church experience. And then I had these, I read John of the Cross, Dark Night of the Soul, almost the first thing I read, which of course went way over my head, but it was what I was drawn to. But it wasn't until after I became a pastor, actually after seminary, I went to Fuller Seminary, and my first job out of seminary was with World Vision. And I spent a year and a half researching and writing about evangelical relationship with nature. It was kind of bridging that theology of dominion into a theology of stewardship. And the kits that I wrote then were sent to 50,000 different evangelical churches. And it was called Let the Earth Be Glad. And this was really my first step into making that connection. But it was really about having churches understand that caring for creation was part of their Christian responsibility and calling, part of our. So within that context, it was really about how do we bring elements of nature into the church? And so they were like worship materials and things like that. And then I was a pastor for a while. And then for 7 years, I left the church. I left going to church. I left being a pastor for a lot of different reasons. And during that time, I started a nonprofit with my son called Kids versus Global Warming. He was awakened to the reality of the climate crisis and he was sort of like a pre-version of Greta 15 years ago, where we spent all of his adolescence on the road, 2 weeks out of every month, traveling, and he would speak. And I helped organize youth-led marches and lawsuits and all that kind of stuff. But I found that the same thing was missing from my environmental work that I felt missing, but I didn't have language for in the church. And what I was able to do after leaving that is deepen into what is that was missing. And it was what I started to discover. I went back to the church as an associate pastor after that 12 years as that nonprofit. And what I was relinking was that it's about relationship. It's like beyond stewardship is still something that is based in kind of instead of an I-thou relationship, it was an I-thing relationship. There's something about a actual relationship with the natural world that you actually care about this tree. It's a particularity that I first encountered through Thomas Merton. For those last 2 years of leaving the church, which I'm putting quotes in the air, because I left the institution, but not the relationship with God. But I found that reconnection starting to happen through Thomas Merton, where he would talk about, this particular cult, this particular field is singing praise to God. And then as we disconnect with God, as we disconnect with the natural world and call it the environment that holds humans, it's just like an environment out there that is about serving us and being a natural resource for us, or that we appreciate even, is still disconnected. And so I started to open up to this reality that we are connected, that there is something in this cedar tree that I see outside of my window that embodies Christ, that is the same kind of, or a version of an embodiment of Christ that I am. And that as we are connected, that there is a presence of Christ. And so I started to be curious about that and research that. And so I can get into that a little bit later, but it was that, my connection with the natural world has always begun theologically. And then that gave me language to sort of validate or give context to the experience of God in connection, in relationship with the natural world.
So practically speaking, what does that relationship look like? If you felt the need to touch God on a given day, what do you actually do?
I'm very blessed. I live in a place where I can walk one way, I can walk west, and I hit the bay in a 5-minute walk, and I can walk east, and I hit a forest in about a 10-minute walk. So I walk down to the bay, and there's a little quiet place where there's not a sidewalk next to it. And I just sit there. There's a log there, and I'm able to sit there. And, we can call it centering prayer. We can call it terra divina, like lectio divina. We can call it prayer. We call it whatever we want, but it's my practice is to just be there and just sit there and allow myself to center in on being present in that place and listen for the voice of God through all things. And so as I was sitting there yesterday, there's this Canadian geese couple that didn't follow the rest of the flock south this winter. And so they stayed here with the other ducks and the seagulls. And so I know them, and I see them several times a week. And yesterday there was only one. And it was heartbreaking. She was just swimming around the whole bay. Her voice was hoarse. Like you could tell she had been crying. And then I started noticing that other birds were alone. It was just this odd noticing. There was a single crow and a single mallard. And as I was just watching them and feeling myself resonate with the mourning of this goose, which I came back and researched it, and geese mate for life, so they do mourn for months when their mate is killed. I could feel my own heartbreak, and I started crying, and I could feel my own, like a sense sort of rose within me, a voice that I recognize now as a voice of God within me, just sort of not even with words, but recognizing my own aloneness, that my own busyness. I live alone now. My kids are launched. And I've been just sort of busy with all of the things to do and connected through Zoom and haven't really felt or leaned into my own aloneness. And so that was a breaking that I know is connected with God, that I know I wouldn't have been able to break into without that connection to this mourning goose. And so it was a connection both with her and with my own. There's a mirroring that I call a sacred reciprocity. It's not my word. It's a word that's been used for centuries, but it's a reciprocity of relationship that we are mirrored through one another, not only other humans, but through other beings.
Yeah, it really does. And I think as we move in to talk about the Wild Church Network and your own Wild Church, I think our listeners are going to see how your personal journey has really led you there and helped you shape it. And for those who are unfamiliar with Wild Church, could you tell us a little bit about it? What makes a wild church wild? What makes a wild church a church? Give us a picture of what you are leading.
I think I need to start with a story again, which is true. There isn't a particular statement of faith because there's a range. When new people are interested in starting a new church, they come from all different denominations, there's a huge breadth of theology around that. And yet there are certain things that I've observed do overlap. So it's something that's emerging. And so it's not something that, I and a couple other people decided we're going to start this new thing. And here's what it takes to join the Wild Church Network. And here's what you need to do. And here's the statement of faith that I'll send you in a PDF document. It's not like that. It's more an observance of something that is emerging that is bigger than us, that we would call the Spirit. For example, when I started Church of the Wild in Ojai, California, I had been wrestling with this and thinking about it and for about 2 years. And I was an associate pastor at the time. And so I didn't preach that often, about once a quarter. And whenever I did, I would preach about something that I had been wrestling with around this. Like, what if God isn't a noun? It's more of a verb. What does that look like? What does it mean that all of our spiritual ancestors, almost every single one in the scriptures, were led into wilderness at a pivotal moment in history and at a pivotal moment in their own leadership? What does that mean? It was actual wilderness. Like, I'd been sort of metaphorizing it as a preacher. I'd been saying it was a metaphor for a tough time or dark night of the soul or something, but it was like, wait a minute. They were all sent into actual wilderness. What does that mean? We don't touch on that. And so it was those kinds of questions that I was wrestling with. So I started to talk about this and started to wonder with my congregation, which was a community church. And I was saying, what if church met outside and we didn't have a building? And I was realizing that churches were built with a architectural theory that began in Rome, where they would build buildings so that there were no windows to the outside nature, and there were only windows and doors to an inside courtyard, so that they can control the natural, flowers and everything. And then churches started to take on that same architectural theory, and any windows that were there were covered with, stained glass or something. A lot of more modern churches, have windows and look out onto mountains, but there's still that disconnection. And that disconnection has a real message, whether we say it explicitly or not. What it says is what is in here is holy, and therefore what is out there is not sacred. And so nobody says that, but you just get that feeling like we communicate in more ways than with our words. And so I started to just question things like this. And the day I left that church was my final sermon and was a goodbye. A group of about 20 people gathered around me and said, that church you've been talking about that meets outside, like, do that. We want to go there. And I told them, I said, I am making that up. That is not a real thing. That's like heresy. I can't do that. And so I decided I would just start talking with them. We met in our living room for about 2 months, a familiar way that new churches are planted, right? And I kept trying to put it back onto them, like, well, what do you want to do? What do you have in mind? And finally, one of them drew me aside and said, stop going so feminine on us. Take this in your hands. You have this vision, just do it. And I actually wasn't offended because I knew what he meant. Sort of my feminine leadership is much more collaborative and wanting everybody's voice. And, he wasn't saying, don't be a woman. He was saying, there are values to both the feminine and the masculine. And what is being called of you right now is a little bit more of a stepping up and taking ownership of this and accepting that you've been called to something and doing it. After he said that, it was like, all right, we're launching. It was Advent of 2015. And so we gathered under a oak tree in Ojai near an empty wash. I didn't really spend a lot of time explaining, even though I had spent about 5 years investigating this and wrestling with this in my own spiritual life. I didn't spend a lot of time explaining it. I just kind of had a framing in the beginning where we had an invocation and a call to worship, and we had a couple of musicians there, and it was just this beautiful setting of us sitting out in a circle under this oak tree. And then I said, and our sermon comes from the blue jays and from the empty wash and from the oak trees. And so I sent them out for 20 minutes to listen to the sacred in the land. And they said to me, they're like, wait, are you kidding me? What am I going to do? Talking to a rock for 20 minutes? And I just sort of said, just try it. And everybody came back in 20 minutes and said, we need more time. I was barely able to enter into this. But then what we do is after people come back and basically allow themselves to be drawn to some place and something. And sometimes people have an agenda. I want to get down to the creek or something. And I sort of warn against that the voice of the sacred usually comes in the form of something surprising. And so when you have an agenda, sometimes you're okay, but sometimes you are overlapping your agenda over that which the natural world and the sacred is calling you. And so after you allow yourself to be drawn to something, and then you sit down. So say it's this cedar tree, you sit down. There's a practice that Native Americans, or actually almost all indigenous religions who haven't been disconnected with the natural world, that they do, and it's actually something beautiful we can learn from without appropriating or without abandoning our own tradition. And one of the things they do is they ask permission for a relationship. It's sort of like an actual relationship. If you meet somebody in a coffee shop, you don't just hug them and start asking intimate questions or telling them your life story. There's either an explicit permission or an implicit one. Sometimes you get like a no, this is not a place to center in. And sometimes you feel a welcoming. And it's that same sense of allowing your imagination, allowing your emotions, allowing your embodied presence, which is all the same things about prayer and what it means to actually connect with God. It's that those same practices of prayer that we do in relationship with others, both other humans and others who are not human. And so as you settled down before this cedar tree, kind of just asking, it's kind of a praise, like, you are beautiful. I've never noticed you before. And, a lot of people don't say anything out loud, but it's that kind of interaction. And then opening up and allowing thoughts and memories to come up within yourself and trusting that. And people come back then and share their experience, and it is absolutely remarkable. I mean, you see something that I was frustrated with as a pastor is what was church would stay on Sunday, as much as we talked about that we didn't want that to happen. And then the rest of the week was just sort of like their life, and then they'd come back and be sort of spiritual again. And this was taking the act of transformation seriously. It's like people would come back and say, this little 45-minute experience brought up this for me. And I saw, let me use my example yesterday. I was able to see and encounter my own loneliness. I remembered a time when I, made a vow that I would never love again. And this encounter with this squirrel broke that wound open, and I was able to cry for the first time. Whatever it is, people come back and they share those experiences. And so then the sermon becomes both that experience, that direct mystical experience with God, and then sharing that and seeing the connections with one another. And then there's usually communion and a benediction.
It's interesting. I have recently joined a community that actually is practicing the sort of revelation in nature as a means of understanding God, of connecting to God. And I've observed that the experience really spans a spectrum in some ways. On the one hand, there are times when I'm actually, as you just explained, drawn to look inward, to understand new things about myself, to hear the Spirit speaking truth about me, about my life, about my actions. There are other times when I'm called outside of myself completely, and I'm really more drawn to the transcendent, to that sense of God that is so much bigger than me. Just the other day, as part of our going out, it was a rainy day, and I went out to sit on the porch watching the rain. And somehow I heard the sound of a bird, and I turned my head, and somehow that triggered me to actually breathe in. And as I breathed in, I smelled the rain. And as I smelled that beautiful smell that's so clean and fresh, I thought, wait, have I not been breathing for the last hour? Because I've been here. Why did I not smell the rain? And suddenly that just drew me to perceive the world around me in a way that wasn't mediated through me, right? It was just not self-oriented. And I realized that the stresses of the week had really caused me to get just way into myself too much. And so it just drew me out to see beyond myself, to see the beauty that was around me, but maybe most importantly, to sense just the bigness of God all around me. And it was really, really powerful. So it is so interesting how, as you put it, there isn't any prescriptive experience or even methodology.
Thank you for adding that, because it's true. It's like, can't remember who said it, but all great truths, a great truth, because all great truths, the opposite is also true. And so in order for us to go inward and see that our presence here is very important and urgently important at this moment in history, and at the same time, the opposite is also very true, that we are an insignificant, small part of something so much bigger. And that is it. Like, there's so many times people have said, I've run this trail. I just talked to somebody yesterday and said, I've lived in this apartment for 30 years. And I've walked by these trees down to this lake in the middle of Los Angeles millions of times. And yesterday was the first time I stopped and actually looked at this tree that has been growing throughout my whole life, and really appreciated it and saw that it is surviving in the midst of this chaos of Los Angeles. Of all of the things that we're facing right now, there's a bigger story that we're part of. We are part of a great story that expands beyond us. that God is at the center of.
One thing that drives the Earthkeepers community is an almost desperate need to make ways for people we love to connect to God and to community with all of creation. So many of those who are done with religion have invested for years in their religious institutions and yet have walked away from them because tired forms no longer inspire or give life or draw them closer to God. So many among younger generations find that the church lacks relevance to the real-world concerns they face and do little to help them connect their deep needs to an actual experience of God who actively cares about every aspect of their lives. You probably know someone who fits this description, and as they come to mind, you might even feel a deep ache over their essential disconnection, or very possibly the sadness of separation from God, from creation, might be your own. For all such folk, the wild churches aim to create a hopeful alternative. Just as Earthkeepers do, they believe that the very nature of spiritual practice needs to be reimagined, and that the very shape of religious community needs to be completely reformed. In their essential deconstruction and ultimate reconstruction of what church means, wild churches create space in their communities for those of us who don't belong.
I love how what we're talking about isn't as simple as just, hey, get out into the non-human creation some more and enjoy it. The picture you're painting, and Forrest, your comment as well, points to something that's much more integrative. And it strikes me as very compelling to me, part of my own experience, and clearly part of what the Wild Church Network and the Wild Church movement is all about. This is the description from your website about the way the Wild Church Network interacts with your church in Bellingham, which I found really lovely. I'd love to read. Every month, we venture into the cedar woods or to the shore of salmon rivers and engage in conversation with the holy in the stunning natural world of the Pacific Northwest, learning to listen and remember that interdependent relationship with the larger than human beloved community is a return to connection, the true meaning of religion, religios, which is a wonderful picture of religion at its best, bringing together, reconnecting things that have been pulled apart, whether that's in our own personal life, in our social relationships with family and friends and community, or with the larger natural world. And I think that a lot of people are really searching and aching for that kind of religion that brings things back together that have been torn apart. How do you see that happening in your own congregation or in the larger Wild Church Network?
I think it's a worldview shift. And so we can see glimpses of it, and it's sort of unpacking how disconnected we are from one another, from ourselves, from the natural world. You know, the language that we use, calling forests timber, calling cows cattle, calling the natural world natural resources, all of those, having no pronouns for the natural world other than it, which deepens that disconnection. And then recognizing that worldview of separation is connected also with our separation from one another. It allows us to other others. And when something or someone is othered, it can be abused. You can choose to clear cut an area because it has no value other than how it serves us. It has no inherent meaning. It has no being in and of itself, inherent value. And we do that with other people. We do that with other races. We do it with genders throughout our history. And so at the core, this kind of othering and domination really is extremely dangerous. And it's led us to the ecological crises that we're facing right now, as well as, many social crises. And so healing that separation, it's what Thomas Berry said 40 years ago, that we need to move from seeing everything else as a collection of objects. We need to move from that into seeing all things as a communion of subjects. And so practicing that subjectivity shifts people, even changing just pronouns and calling this tree instead of an it, a she or a he. There's something shifts within you, and it softens you and it opens you up and allows a new worldview that I think is emerging. It's not like we're going to bring this new worldview in. It is happening on the edges. And as the same pushback is happening that wants to other people more violently, there is a rising at the edges of our religion, of our culture, that is saying, we are interdependent, beloved community beyond our church, beyond our family. So I think that's a really important part of why we're doing this, and some churches do more specific things. Like there's a church that's sort of on the edges of the Wild Church Network. I would say, Forrest, your church is definitely a wild church. And so part of it is just, what is this? And how do we define this in a way that we're all included? That really what we're about is shifting this worldview and shifting this actual relationship. Here's another quote that I can't remember the person who said it. We don't protect what we don't love. We don't love what we don't know. We don't know what we don't spend time with, and we don't develop relationship with. And so spending a dozen years in the climate movement, trying to get people to get angry, to get upset, to see all of the problems in the world, and we got to sign this petition and do this march, and like that constant, like, all right, here's this new thing, here's this new petition to sign. That constant againstness is, first of all, exhausting, leads to burnout. And secondly, it's grounded in something besides love. And so when love is not at the core of a movement, of a shift, I can't trust that it's the coming of the kingdom of God that all of this is about, I think. I see even liturgies starting to change kingdom, which is an idea and a concept that it doesn't have a lot of relevance for us right now, into kingdom. Just even that shift of language, that this is a larger kingdom of family relationships that the kingdom of God is all about. And so what has happened in this church I was about to mention, they have 7 acres that have just sort of like been there, and they have a regular church building there. And they just have started to go, wait a minute, we have not paid attention to the 7 acres. We've never gone out to sort of listen to the 7 acres, even in a permaculture sort of way. Like, what makes this land thrive? And what does this land have to do with our having this sacred community here that meets inside of this building? And what would it look like to expand our sense of beloved community to all of the trees and flowers and beings and little ant creatures that live here? And so they're starting to explore that. And so once a quarter, they're going out and having a service outside, doing a communion service outside, and including the other beings as co-congregants, that we are all, the Psalms say it over and over, that we are, the mountains and the rivers and the trees are all praising God. And when we objectify the natural world, we desacralize them. And we therefore cut ourselves off from expressions of praise and glory to God. And so I think, once you have a relationship with a tree, say, like Julia Butterfly Hill in the 70s, who sat in a tree, that was sort of like this crazy environmentalist back then. But she developed an actual relationship with the tree. She named the tree Luna. And so when that tree was cut down, after protesting it for a few years, it was cut down. It was devastating. So she was personally brokenhearted about it. She cared personally about this tree. It wasn't just like, I hate driving and seeing clear-cut forest. It's just sort of heartbreaking. But if I knew that forest, my son has a story where the forest he connected with up in Squamish, where he went to college at Quest University. And he knew this little part of the forest that he watched be clear-cut. It messed him up. I mean, it was devastating. You fall in love. You are in love with this camellia bush outside of me, outside of my window. You're going to do something different. You're going to treat the soil differently. You're going to treat what else happens around that bush. If you care about the land in a relationship, you're going to act differently. It's not just recycling because someone tells you to, or it's not just, I'm going to compost because I read an article that I should do that. You do it because you care, because you're in a loving relationship with all that is.
It strikes me that a lot of our listeners are going to resonate in terms of what you're saying, how it jives with some of their experience. And yet they're going to hesitate, I think, because it also doesn't feel right, or it might not coincide with what they've been taught in church. And they may be wondering, this sounds a little out there. This sounds like innovation or some kind of wacky environmental thing that I sort of wonder, is this leading to pantheism? Are we going to start worshiping creation? Are we going to start putting trees and bushes before people? And that can feel disconcerting to folks. And I'm sure you get that kind of reaction quite a bit. How do you respond to the folks who feel like, whoa, the things that you're offering and talking about feel a little dangerous to maybe the foundation of faith that they've been brought up on?
It's actually interesting how seldom it does come up. I expected it a lot more. And I think it's because it's connecting with something that people have experienced versus learned. But I think it's still true. I think what you're saying is still absolutely true. And it's something that takes a while. It's like a worldview shift that you don't realize how deeply embedded it is. There's a difference between praising God through all that is and reading the Psalms and knowing that the Psalms are not just talking about the trees praising God as a metaphor, that there's something real in that. It does require you to kind of question some of the things that you've learned. And sometimes you learn things never explicitly. It's sort of like with the building, what's in here is sacred, what's out there isn't sacred. Like I was never explicitly taught in my evangelical experience that, we should be careful to care about trees because we might start worshiping them. Like that was never explicitly said, but I definitely felt that. I definitely felt that fear. Where did that come from? What is that? I think there is a difference between worshiping God through appreciating deeply this other being, just like if you are in love with your spouse, it doesn't mean you start worshiping your spouse and your spouse becomes a substitute for God. And yet your spouse is a vehicle of God's grace, of God's love, of God's words. And so it really isn't like, why do we make a difference from what is this anthropocentric barrier that has grown within the church? Where did that come from? I think that's where my curiosity began. Where did this begin? And so I started reading, just history, church history of how this became such a separation and a disconnection, because it hasn't always been this way. This has not always been a Christian foundational practice or belief that we must be scared of the natural world, that caring about it too much will lead to pantheism. This is a pretty new evolution of our faith. Throughout most of history, we humans, including Christians, were so integrated into the natural world that it was, Jesus used examples from the natural world all the time. Consider the lilies. That didn't just mean take a look at them quickly. The word there was like a deep consideration, a deep meditation, and really think about this and have these kind of interactions. Job talks about it a lot, about, listen to the animals. What do they have to tell you? Like once you have eyes to see past that fear of, I don't want to go outside of the boundaries of what I've been told is allowed and is not allowed. Once you begin to have, sort of like your eyes can see differently, I've experienced a whole new connection with the scriptures, that things are coming alive to me, just like seeing that, why did God bring the people of Israel across the Red Sea intentionally? It was like this intentional thing. Yes, they could have gotten to the promised land easier. It actually says that. Could have taken this shortcut to the promised land, but instead God sent them into the wilderness, which ended up being 40 years for a lot of reasons. And we've all preached about what those reasons are. But we never really encountered why into the wilderness? Why not into another city? What is that? What is that relationship? And I think as we deepen into the reality that this is not pantheism, then we can and see that in the scriptures there are example after example of very close connection with the natural world. Then we have to start to question, why is this feel so dangerous? And I'm not an expert, but I'll just tell you what the insights were for me, was that as Christianity became a state religion around the 4th century, it became a tool of empire. And one of the things that was necessary for empire to take over and colonize new lands was to disconnect people from their relationship with the land so that they could be, this wasn't just way back in the Roman days, but, it happened all over the British colonies when they were breaking off from the Catholic Church. It happened in America when the church was coming over to this new land, that needing to disconnect the people from their deep relationship with the land was objective of colonization, so that they could be removed from the land, so that they could be taken off. And so you start to question, even the word pagan means from the country, means those people out in the countryside that haven't come into the city and understood what the parameters are for the religion. And so that's not, and it never has been for me, understanding the ways that our religion has been used and abused by people in power for their own control. I didn't take away the reality of the deep connection that I have with our tradition and with our scriptures. But it does help you to kind of disconnect some of the things that don't really make sense with your heart, that don't really make sense with your experience. And so it's sort of an allowing of yourself to honor your own inner authority and your own experience of God, as well as listening to the church. And it may mean that you may run into some issues, not only within yourself, but with some others within your community that don't understand that your loving creation does not mean that you are worshiping a tree rather than God. There's another kind of theological, it was really a word study, a couple of word studies that helped me. The word for wilderness in the Old Testament that's used more than 300 times is midbar. And it's a derivative of a word called dabar, which means speak, to speak. And so midbar actually means the organ which speaks, like your mouth. But that is the etymology of that word wilderness, that you go into the wilderness because the wilderness will speak to you. And it's used in the Old Testament in a very loving way that we didn't have eyes to see until you kind of dig deeper to go, what was meant, 3,000 years ago in a way that we don't have as much access to. And so I think understanding that the wilderness is speaking to us gives us a different framework that helps us when those questions come up.
Something you've said, a word in particular that has stood out to me, was the word trust when it comes to trusting our experience. Because on the one hand, many of us have been conditioned to be suspicious of nature as revelation, as nature as the place to connect to God. But the fact is that very few of us have not actually had that experience. And so I think a bridge perhaps into understanding what it is you're talking about, what it is the Wild Church Network practices, is to look at our own experience and look at the truth that we have actually experienced truth and experienced God in creation, and to come to terms with that, not to dismiss that as important, relevant, authentic, meaningful. So yeah, I'm struck by that, and I think in some ways that bridge becomes more powerful even than the best theological defense for that sort of creation as revelation stance. Is look to your heart, look to see what God has done in you.
Yeah, and I just want to piggyback on that real quick to say that I think this is a very natural approach for children. One of the unexpected blessings of the current disruptions and spending more time at home has been my 6-year-old Teddy and I spending most mornings before the rest of the household gets up doing what we're calling red chair time. We have 2 red chairs on our front porch that look out over our front yard and out onto the street, quietly wrapped in blankets, the dog sitting on our lap, listening to the birds, watching the neighborhood slowly wake up. And this morning, we read Psalm 148 together. And it's just a poetic description of every aspect of creation giving praise to God. kind of the ecological picture of creation in all its diversity and unity, offering up thanks and praise to the Creator. And Teddy didn't ask me whether this was theologically appropriate or whether it was okay. He just nodded his head and looked at the female duck that was resting in the sunshine on our front grass. And he just gets it in a way that I think some of us need to recover.
I wonder out loud about this shift in worldview that you're talking about, Victoria. And really, I'm curious about your take on why this is more than just an interesting choice we could make to change up our spiritual lives. I think about Teddy, and I think about how he is growing up. And part of me thinks, oh, James, I wish you were my dad. But I'm also looking at Teddy's life and I'm thinking, man, he is going to grow up with just a very different sense of God. And as you pointed out, there won't be those barriers to connecting to creation as he does, as part of his living faith. My question, I guess, is why is this actually necessary, in particular for Teddy's generation and for all of the younger folks who have been steadily exiting the church and finding it irrelevant, finding that the teachings and the culture of the church don't actually help them to connect to God? And so I'm wondering how this fits into that bigger picture of perhaps what God is doing in the church to change the church and to make it more relevant, to make it more meaningful. What are your thoughts about that?
The millennials are not going to come back to church unless something like this makes that connection for them. I know just sort of anecdotally for me, how many times I've explained what I'm doing with Wild Church and people say, oh my gosh, I would have never left church if this was a reality, or that I can do, that's something that I can go to a church like that. There's actually even a Pew survey that said, the question was, where have you had your most numinous experiences, most connected with God? And like 73% of people that don't go to church said it had something to do with nature. And the really interesting thing is that almost 70% of the people that do go to church, their most numinous experience was in connection with nature.
I really like how you talk about how this is really for everyone. This isn't just for someone who already likes to be outside a lot. This is about tapping into something that we all share. And when I look at the Wild Church Network, it's intriguing to me that you have churches from Florida, across the South, in the Midwest, up through our region in the Pacific Northwest and in British Columbia, that clearly it's touching a chord with people in different regions, in different contexts. They're doing things very differently from church to church, allowing local expressions and forms to emerge there. It seems like the Wild Church Network is still, in a way, in its infancy and growing and taking its first few steps. When you think about people who may be listening to us that are intrigued by what you're doing and what you're calling us to, what would be some first steps for them?
To take one little step might be today to go outside and allow yourself to just praise God in all that is. Taking the time to just pay attention. It's kind of like both of you mentioned something like your red chair time, of just taking that time. And it's astonishing that you realize, how have I not smelled this rain before? And so I think it's very, very simple things. There's something in our own spiritual journey that is missing, that we can recreate in no other way than an actual relationship with all that is. We're at an urgent point in history. Our species is being called into a different relationship.
We've been talking with Victoria Loorz, founder of the Wild Church Network. If you would like to know more about the Wild Church Network, you'll find helpful links and resources in this episode's notes section. Perhaps there is a wild church where you live, or perhaps you would like to start a wild church in your region. You'll find information about such things on the Wild Church website. And please, do keep your eyes open for Victoria Loorz's new book called Church of the Wild, published by Broadleaf and Fortress Press, to be released in the fall of 2021. Earthkeepers podcast explores ways in which we can change ourselves, our communities, and our cultures to help us to care for the earth in holistic and regenerative ways. Through curated conversations, we highlight the wisdom of thought leaders and change agents who are making a difference and showing us a way forward. When Earthkeepers stand together, they amplify the impact of their resistance against environmental injustice and multiply their efforts for renewal and restoration. We invite you to support us by becoming a subscriber. You can help us reach more people with our message by leaving a positive review on Apple Podcasts. And please, share Earthkeepers podcast with anyone you know who seeks a better relationship to the earth. This podcast is an expression of Circlewood, an organization whose purpose it is to cultivate transformative communities that love and care for all creation. If you'd like to learn more about the Circlewood community, please visit our website at www.circlewood.online or write to us at podcast@circlewood.online. I'm Forrest Inslee, your podcast host. Our executive producer is James Amadon. Forrest Reed is our sound engineer and the creator of our original music. Our research assistant is Rochelle Nordman. Thank you, friends, for listening. And please join us for our next conversation on the Earthkeepers podcast.